This is our third TBM Tuesday live session. My name is Annie Kyle and I manage the series for the TBM Council. For those of you who are new to this event series, the TBM Tuesdays are a regular series focused really on key topics for technology and finance leaders. I'm very pleased that today I'm joined by Keith Barthelmeus. I practice how to pronounce his surname quite a few times. So Keith is the Global VP and CFO at Brinks, and he will share some insights of his TBM journey today with you. Also, Keith is going to be joined by Todd Tucker, who is the VP of Standards and Education for the TBM Council. And before I will hand it off to our speakers today, I just want to remind everyone that we really set up this series for you, so you have a platform where you can learn from each other, share best practices, and just engage with your peers. So we welcome you all to participate, ask as many questions as you like, speak up. You can all post your questions in the Q&A box or on the chat. And lastly, I just really want to thank everyone for participating. This is the third session, as I mentioned, and we've seen a great amount of people coming back. So we're really, really pleased. And without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Todd.
All right, Annie, thank you very much. And Keith, just wonderful to have you on. Thanks so much for joining us today and sharing your experiences and your insights and all that goodness. I think it'll be a great conversation. So we'll just jump in. You know, one of the places we always start with these is really just tell us about, you know, Brinks, the situation that you had there, your role, a little bit even about your IT operating model. Like, just give us a little bit of the lay of the land, and inclusive of like your team. Where does your team sit? How does it operate, if you don't mind?
Sure. Well, let me start off with a little bit about Brink. So we are the global leader in total cash management, secure-based, route-based secure logistics, and payment solutions. Our customers include finance institutions, retailers, government agencies, mints, jewelers, to name a few. We have operations in 49 countries and serve customers in over 100 countries. We're ultimately focused on the safety, security, and reliability of our customers' most valuable assets, being cash and precious commodities. I've been with Brinks for about 3.5 years. I've got responsibilities that range from finance to strategic sourcing, even have transformation and innovation, which are fairly unique to combine with the other responsibilities. And I sit in the IT and product organization, reporting both to our EVP, CIO, CDO, and our corporate CFO. I previously had so COVID has changed us a little bit. First off, we are a global organization. We do have a global shared service center based out of Coppell, Texas, where we serve many countries. And then we also have country-led IT organizations. The responsibilities that I have around finance are all-encompassing, so that we could start to look at leveraging economies of scale. And TBM is certainly a part of that journey that we're on. So today, while we've got local country-level IT organizations and a global shared service center, we have recently introduced a regional model. So we think globally, act regionally and locally to ensure that we're meeting the needs of the business. And I've recently shifted the TBMO function, or the administrative function, the technology function, out of my organization and into our development organization, where we can have people focus more on the delivery of the data that we can then leverage to take us down the rest of our strategy from here.
Yeah, excellent, Keith. And I had the pleasure of visiting you guys a few months back. It seems like, you know, a couple of years now, given everything that's happened. And it was a pleasure to kind of see, you know, how you guys operate, to have some of the folks in those regions join us for the training that we did. I think that was really a wonderful approach. You know, Keith, what was the situation that, you know, drove you down the path of TBM?
We had a bit of practice. So just over 3.5 years ago, the same leadership team that I'm with now, we were at a company called Recall, and similar to Brinks, it was a company that needed a turnaround. And as part of that, this leadership team formed together for the first time. We had a similar focus on how to provide margin contribution and drive top line benefit. As such, in the technology space, that's where I launched a TBMO for the first time. And we had a lot of successes as a result of that, but we also had a lot of trial and error along the way. Leaving that and understanding what we were able to accomplish, we had a playbook that we wanted to build on at Brinks. So TBM was already one of the guiding principles coming in. It was really a matter of making sure that we were right sized for the organization and driving operational excellence through financial practices as well, with a better understanding of what our total cost of delivering any solution was. So when I first came in, I was given a very high level target that the board had requested of our technology spend, which was to drive our our costs as a percent of revenue down by 30 basis points over the course of the next 3 years. I gladly accepted that without an understanding or any clarity into what our spend was. But then it really took better understanding and uncovering what the spend within our organization was. Now it's a task I'm taking on without understanding what the perception of IT was. So I first went out and started meeting with business leaders and leaders throughout the organization to understand that they've fired us in the past. We were the Department of No, the black box. Todd, as you're the author of the book, every quote in your book was absolutely quoted when meeting with a lack of trust, meeting with a lot of folks in our organization that over many years were not getting what they expected from IT. So I felt we had a pretty easy task, actually. When you understand the challenges, those challenges are really overcome through transparency and having some hard conversations. But it was the task going in was truly to create a more efficient cost model for IT, and it was TBM was absolutely the guiding principle for that.
Yeah. That Department of No comment comes up all the time. It's one of the sort of universal truths where IT has more demand for it than it can, service. And I think that is, to your point, it gets to the hard conversations. You have to be willing to have those hard conversations and have the facts to back them up, probably just as crucial. One of the things that you've talked about then is making this 3-year commitment to the company, about slowing down the relative rate of the growth in the tech and IT costs, while again, still funding, increased demand for innovation, and doing that compared to or relative to revenue growth. Can you talk a bit more about that?
I can. So one, we're a 160-year-old company, 161 this year. We just celebrated last year. So as you can imagine, we've got a lot of legacy technologies, and we were largely underinvested in technology as well. Coming in, this is a company, a very physical company that had not yet really met that digital inflection point, I would say. So coming in to have that task of reducing our overall spend as a percentage of revenue, we knew that we would have to make investments along the way. So we really started looking at this in 2 slices. One is our traditional IT cost, and then one would be looking at our, what would it take to keep the lights on, and the other would be our total technology cost, which we have another chunk that we internally label as business technologies, and that would be any technologies that are tied to cost of goods sold or SG&A to support revenue growth or support customer functionality. And so there were 2 pieces of this. We wanted to provide operating leverage to really drive margin contribution. As the business grew and revenue grew, we would grow at less of that rate. So we landed on a target of about 50% of the rate of revenue growth. We would grow IT as a percentage of revenue. That would help us receive that, or get to that task that we had of reducing our spend by the 30 basis points. And then we want to provide, I would say, business leverage by way of saying, let's also shift our spend in technology. So while we're reducing the overall cost as a percentage of revenue, we're increasing our percentage of spend that goes towards driving revenue. And we were able to achieve that through a series of exercises. We start very simply with benchmarking. Benchmarking, while it's certainly got its challenges, it's directional, and it gives you a baseline for where you are versus the industry. Because we were such a traditional company, or a traditional physical legacy company, we leveraged a peer group in the transportation space. So when we were comparing benchmarks, we started with transportation, but we as a company are certainly moving more into the banking and finance space. So we always had an understanding of the difference between the two, and directionally set it on the transportation, so that we can really kind of clean up and have baselines from relative peer groups. It helped us to really look at which areas of, whether it's categories or in total, people and total spend, where we needed to put our focus first, and it gave us some really low-hanging fruit to work with. And now we're at a point where we've done a lot of that initial cleanup work, and we're starting to look at our digital investments and where we need to move more towards banking and finance. So based on our percentage of revenue as it's distributed between our cash and transit services, which are armored truck services, or those of our money processing and payment solutions, we now are looking at benchmarks that are combined between those two peer groups to reset in this next strat plan that we have for the next 3 years. And that's been helpful as well, directionally.
Yeah. Yeah, and Keith, I know, you and I have talked about this, and it even came up at our last board meeting, the topic of benchmarking, and there's always, a fair bit of, I'll say, consternation when you talk about this with people that, live and work in IT or tech. I think, many have had benchmarking sort of used against them, so to speak. They've had the benchmark comparisons, and maybe it didn't compare apples to apples, or maybe the way they told the story, or somebody else told the story for them, wasn't ideal, things like that. But if you don't mind, and we're going to open a poll here in a minute, but if you don't mind, just share some of your thoughts on, that apples to apples. You talked about using two different peer groups, financial services and transportation, but a little bit more about your experience there.
Sure. You're absolutely right. Benchmarking is something that's easily disputed or defended by people, but it's not intended to be it's intended to be directional, right? It's a compass for us. So we know if you're going to the right sources of benchmarking, and with an Apptio, you've got Rubin Worldwide and ISG and Apptio customers. We also leverage Gartner. We want to make sure that we've got true data points to tie back to, and there's always context behind it. But benchmarking at best is average, right? And we don't want to be average. So directionally, we set a bar and say, let's be better. And then as we identify challenges along the way, we address those, but we're grounded in the reality of there's no right way. There's no guarantee that all the data collected for these customers is the most efficient, but it just gives us a directional pull. And really our shareholders are looking at financials this way with many customers, or many of their where they're investing as well. So there's no reason why we shouldn't do the same in the technology space. But we also take that data and benchmark internally. So, being a global company, having operations in 49 countries, we have the opportunity to look at our structure country by country. So we are not standardized yet as a company. Over 160 years, we're largely made up of acquisitions, and we've got disparate systems all over the globe. And that's quite frankly been a challenge for us to drive TBM because of that data disparity. But as it relates, as we started to track the cost per system, per application, per whatever the technology solution is, we created a standard bucket for each of those costs. So for us, it's very simple. Cash and transit, or armored truck services, has a required operating system to support the business, and we've got dozens of them across the globe. So we could start to look at the TCO associated with each of those systems, and internally benchmark against one another to see where we're efficient and where we've got the right customer satisfaction, where we've got the most efficiencies, and start to say, what are we doing right here, so we could begin to standardize. And that's been hugely valuable for us too. So that's not even leveraging peer groups outside. It's just leveraging comparative data internally to really see where there's opportunities to rationalize and improve on those outcomes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fantastic. I think that, the poll that Annie opened up and now is showing the results reflects, this reality that I think when people think about benchmarking and employing it, they tend to think about the comparison to industry peers. And while there's a lot of, I think, power in that, there's also the challenges that we've talked about with getting apples to apples and having truly comparable, understanding what those comparisons mean and so forth. But Annie, if you don't mind, can you show that again? It disappeared. I don't know if you can pop that back up. But one of the things that you'll see is not as many. Yeah, thank you, Annie. Not as many are doing the internal comparisons. But like you said, Keith, these are very valuable. And if you can find ways to do internal comparisons, sometimes it's just over time, which may be more viewed as a baselining and comparison over time. But again, between internal consumers can be really, really powerful. We've seen this many times where you look at that and you see how one business unit consumes IT or tech versus another business unit, and the differences can be both striking, surprisingly so in some cases, and very informative, that they can lead to changes to the way different business units consume. Sometimes it goes one way where it's like, oh, we're over consuming, or we've got some let's just say lack of discipline there. Other times it can be spotlighting, or it can spotlight where value is being obtained, and it kind of goes the other way. So I think, yeah, to your point, Keith, using all these at your disposal, at least you should consider them. You should consider them as tools in the TBM arsenal when doing that. There are a couple questions that have been submitted. Barack actually is asking a couple of good questions. Let me start with the second one that he asks, and he's asking about IT consolidation when making an acquisition. And Keith, you and I haven't really talked about that, but given the number of acquisitions that Brinks has made over the years, has that been something that you've had to deal with? And if so, what have been sort of the observations that you've had? What works, what doesn't work, if you don't mind?
Sure. Well, I think we had a large portfolio of applications as a result of those acquisitions that we inherited. As we rationalize and again, leveraging benchmarking data is helping us to truly rationalize these applications to to determine where we should land. That's been a very helpful exercise. But for acquisitions, we've been in an inorganic mode for the last 3 years as part of our rebuilding too, and had a number of very large acquisitions. And as we tuck in those acquisitions, we are doing the proper rationalization at that time. In most cases, we've got some small countries that we're bringing on, revenue that doesn't justify it yet, but where we've got material spend and material revenue, we are able to rationalize a little bit quicker, and then we've got a plan to do the same with the others. So as part of integration, we're taking care of that, Bharat, now. We're moving quicker as part of integrating new acquisitions than we are with rationalizing the old that we've inherited, but are certainly, certainly on that path as well. The data that we're taking away from benchmarking, the internal benchmarking, is really helping us to have the fact-based discussions with our leaders in the countries where they may be emotionally tied to any one solution that they have, to start to justify making that move. This past week, I've spent an awful lot of time communicating some of the value of standardizing an application in Mexico, as an example. And there's other challenges that come out of that from in the current place with this pandemic. We're also challenged with FX headwinds that are largely impacting countries like Mexico that have felt the 18% devaluation this year, year to date. And so having a global cost hit, that's charged in USD hit a country like that is a challenge of itself when you start to talk about rationalizing applications. So where we've got, where we're doing acquisitions and integrations of those acquisitions, it's a much easier, it's much easier to tackle rationalization than it is the legacy at this point in time.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. And just to kind of paraphrase what you said, as you make acquisitions, the rationalization of the applications that are brought in through that acquisition becomes, very important. The challenge, though, is when you have other countries where there's an adverse foreign exchange rate impact, it can make it difficult to put them on the corporate or centralized applications that you then charge back because they become overly sort of expensive in local terms. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say, yeah. And it's sometimes it's timing, right? But but yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and obviously the timing now being very impacted by COVID and what it's done to the global economy. That's really fascinating. I appreciate that. He asked another question, which is interesting here, kind of relating it to COVID, which is what percentage of your portfolio is SaaS-based, and has that changed since COVID?
I should be able to quote right now, but I would say that it was next to none. Cloud was kind of a bad word, and in a lot of companies with that pride themselves on security, cloud was late to be accepted. We have done a significant amount of work to move to the cloud. So we've got a hybrid data center where all non-prod is in the cloud, and any overflow capacity requirements go into the cloud as well. We've migrated to Salesforce, to ServiceNow, to Workday. So we're largely migrating to the cloud, and then being able to leverage that standardized approach as we introduce those to start to tuck in other countries.
Absolutely. Keith, another question here in the chat from Suresh. It kind of relates to actually the next item I have in our discussion guide. It's about kind of the conversations that you're having and how you drive accountability. What Suresh points out is, he said, considering your history over 160 years, he would assume that IT would have been operating more like a tech production house, and then transforming, as you all are doing, into a value driving house, as he puts it, means getting IT and people in IT to take a lot of accountability and having a different mindset. Of course, that's also something that you and I talked about, back with the training. How do we instill the right accountability, and how do you have the right conversations with the right people? So it's kind of a big topic there, but you mind going into, like, who are you driving the conversations with? Who is being held accountable? How are you changing that?
Great question. It's at every level, at every role, we have this discussion. First, I'd say within the IT space, traditional IT organizations think it's all about them as well, and they're very siloed in their thought process. So not even as a general IT organization, but within their specific domain, and the business can't do without them. We had to change that very quickly. We really started to have the value conversation and shift that focus to business outcomes. That was tremendous. Now, when you're in the business, they don't believe that you understand the business when you've been thinking in this very siloed manner for a long time. So we had to demonstrate it first by having a better understanding, showing data that wasn't necessarily the data that any IT organization would want to look at. Sometimes you got to uncover take the skeletons out of the closet as well in terms of any shelfware or bad decisions that were made. And we had very frank conversations. So the great thing about where we are now is that we've got accountabilities in place. Cost center owners are no longer transactional. They're thinking TCO, and any business case or any funding request that's any budget line item needs to be supported with what's the return. We've got 3 very basic objectives as an entire enterprise, and we certainly live by those in the IT space or the product space as well. And that is accelerating our profitable growth, driving top line benefit, whether it's organic or inorganic. We have another one that we call closing the gap, and it's really driving operational excellence or margin contribution, reducing the cost of keeping the lights on and making sure that we're efficient. And our last one is introducing differentiated services, and this is really where we're becoming a more tech-enabled company. So if there's any transaction being requested, it's gotta be supported by a TCO view with a return, whether it's cost savings or new revenue opportunity, and there's no other acceptable way. So when you train an organization to start thinking that way, they're now tasked with really trying to understand the business and ask the right questions of the business. And we go in partnership now in most projects that we take on. By no means are we perfect, but we have demonstrated that we are on the right trajectory to continue to deliver on the success that we've had over the first 3.5 years. It's actually helping us now. If anything, COVID has helped us in a remote workforce to communicate better, because in order to drive something forward, you've got to get alignment with multiple people, which historically, I think working in an office, people just got a little bit lazy, had general conversations. It wasn't as really, the dependency, you could drag it out a little bit more. Now we're holding people accountable to move quicker and to accelerate any of the plans that we were working on to better articulate the value that's going to come out of it, so that we don't get it, it doesn't get lost in our defunding of anything along the way here with COVID. Yeah.
There's the new joke of what's driving or who's driving your digital strategy. Is it your CEO, your CIO, or COVID? And for many, obviously, it has been heavily accelerated, if nothing else, by COVID. So yeah, that's interesting. I think the way I look at you guys is you've got one part of what you do. You are a central service provider to a global firm with business units that are distributed around the globe. And then you're also a valued partner in our terms, that you're partnering to create potentially new ways of serving customers and driving revenue and things like that. So you're really living in both of those, as we call them, archetypes. The service provider one is always kind of interesting. Certainly that's where you have to drive that efficiency. You have to create fairness in how you hold accountability for consumption and all those things. One of the things that you talked about was actually also driving standardization, and you touched on that a little bit earlier, but can you talk a little bit more about how TBM plays into that, drive for, standard services?
It does. I mean, economies of scale are easily achieved when you've got a large global organization that are historically doing things in their own geo. So some of the things that we looked at was a total cost of driving a service desk, as an example. We've got a lot of countries want to have their local touch. Language comes into play. What we did is we started to really look at the total cost of delivering service desk and identified that we have a captive, for instance, in Panama today, that largely supports LATAM and our North America organization. We don't provide any in EMEA today, so we started to look at what would it take to tuck in EMEA to one organization, and then learn that a follow the sun model may not necessarily work. So we're now looking at geographic distribution of a model that would cater to EMEA and APAC, and one that might cater to LATAM and North America, and ultimately may even land in a regional focus. But what TBM's doing for us is it's allowing us to look at our current costs of these services and start to take that and model out what the cost would be if we do break it into either regional or into two geographies. Having transparency really does a lot to tell a story when you're trying to bring together multiple entities or multiple business units to discuss what they're actually paying for and what they could potentially pay for. We, as a company, and maybe many others think of this as well, is you start to look purely at the economics and not at the value, not at the performance that you're getting out of these. So we're also weighing performance and starting to make decisions or trade-offs as to whether or not we need to have the same SLAs, or if we need tighter SLAs in any one area. That's helping as well, looking at the performance indicators and understanding where we expect to be versus where we are. That's a view that we've never had historically, is bringing the two together, the financial and the performance views. Yeah. And so it's fair to say that as you are looking at different options, different ways of delivering things, whether you call them, options or packages or what have you, right? You can also see what the impact to the cost of it is. You now have those facts. So it makes for a much more informed decision, especially when operating globally. Do you ever, and I probably have talked to you about this, but I don't recall the answer, is do you
do anything to incentivize, or what's the word I'm looking for, where you kind of maybe underwrite or sort of incentivize consumption? I don't know why I'm blanking on a word here, but in other words, where you affect the rates that you charge to different parts of the region, different parts of the world, things like that, to account for local differences and things like that.
So interesting. We are currently, that's part of the solutions I raised earlier. As part of rationalization, we have an opportunity in LATAM, and we're being challenged as a result of the headwinds of foreign exchange. So we are trying to think of creative ways to do a chargeback and a show back to preserve their margins without having that internally, to preserve their performance margins, so that they're incentivized the proper way to make the move for the enterprise. So absolutely, it requires. I don't believe that a full chargeback makes sense in all cases when you're also trying to gain the economies of scale for a global entity. And in the case of those foreign exchange rates, as an example, their personal performance or their compensation internally could be impacted, where they have no levers to change anything once they make that move. So yes, absolutely, we try to do creative things for internal reporting to help with offsetting those, to incentivize them to make the right choice. Excellent. That makes sense?
Hey, it does. It does. Thank you. Leonard is asking a question about did you go about addressing the IT cost optimization journey? In other words, were there specific areas that you focused on to start the process? The top 100 questions and where you kind of got started.
That's a great question, a pretty loaded one as well. I mean, where we started was at the very top, right? We really looked at what is our total spend worldwide, what was our total spend by country, and started to truly using benchmarks from day one to start to look at where we land versus where others in our peer group do. Once we had that, we can go a step down and start looking at the low-hanging fruit, right? Where we were surprised, well, not entirely surprised, but we found in the hardware category, for instance, we were underinvested versus the peer groups. That doesn't mean we want to go out and spend money, but it also supported everything we heard within the IT organization, that this is, this server's on being held together by duct tape at this point. But we also saw where we were overinvested. For us, telecom was just disgustingly high, and it was we were using we had antiquated T1s in most of our markets still. So it gave us some very high level direction to build strategies around improving our sourcing strategy, and then taking that as an example to say, how can we modernize and prepare for our digital revolution as we get to that. So from a pure data standpoint, the data was driving kind of the discussions. Then we had to go out and socialize. First, if you don't have an IT organization on board, then you're not gonna make a lot of progress. So we had to upskill. We had to communicate frequently early on. We had a lot of town halls to discuss what our strategy was and what everyone's role in that strategy would be. And then as we started to pull data together and have the conversations with the business, it became much easier to give them a path forward to reduce their costs and start focusing on the performance. But early on, to get the conversation started, it had nothing to do with the performance. It was 100% about cost. Everyone felt that technology or IT was too expensive, so they need to understand what that was. And we had to start having those discussions with business leaders to gain their support in driving that cost down. Once you say you can reduce their costs, you've got their attention. And then it really becomes about the preferences and starting to work through where there's emotional ties to any one investment that we've made.
Yeah. So you had general sort of agreement on what the high level problem was, that costs were too high, but you let the data drive where you would focus, based on the sort of high level of transparency you had early on, the benchmarking that you had early on, and that's what drove the cost optimization efforts, which makes sense. And it also makes sense that you have to get people on board with the program and the data being used for the program. If there's a lack of confidence or trust in that, then that becomes just a barrier to the program itself. Maurice is asking, has your operating model changed as you've matured TBM, and if so, how?
It has, and it's still changing. One, we were a very locally focused IT organization historically, and right now I'd say we've got, as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, we've finally introduced a regional focus where we've got a regional IT leader, sort of a junior CIO in each of our regions today, where you can start to look across your regions to make sure that we're making better decisions. And then we've got a much more strategic global focus to where we're not trying to be the end all be all to deliver for all countries, but we're really evaluating where it makes sense to distribute shared services across multiple countries. We also were very waterfall. Everything was a project, and it was a very long process to address any projects. And most of the time, the requirements of any of those projects changed before the project was completed, right? So they just lasted forever. So we are becoming more agile, where we've got areas of excellence and trying to drive these practices down through this new regional setup to become more agile in all of our countries as well. We are moving to an IT product line focus so that we're moving from projects to products and starting to align people more with those products, which has helped us quite a bit as well.
Yeah. What would you say, at least from your end of things, what is the biggest challenge or challenges that you're seeing in that shift from project to products?
Quite honestly, we're not funding additional resources. In many cases, to do it right, you've got to add resources so that you have the right team build up in any one of those product lines. So we're trying to do it with either with the team we have or the resource count that we have with the same spend. Funding it has been probably our biggest challenge. So we're doing it product by product right now and aligning people where it seems to make most sense. The other challenge is in the again, there's emotional ties to who should be a part of any one project today, and that goes away when you go to a product line. You've got a dedicated team, and they should have a very entrepreneurial approach to delivering those business outcomes that are expected. I think just the communication of the value it's easier to communicate value than for it to be understood until the business could demonstrate or see that it's demonstrated and proven to be successful. So fairly early days for us where we don't have products across the board. And I'd say with each one that we try to stand up, we'll probably be faced with those same challenges and have to get some quick wins to show that value.
Yeah. And what you've described, certainly, I'm sure, more sort of seeing the same challenge with having enough funds, especially with COVID, putting that kind of pressure. So the timing isn't always ideal. And then secondly, we hear a lot just of folks that are just trying to figure out how they fund in this new model. If a project-based funding model, you can disagree with the approach and all that, but at least it was, well understood. With a product-based funding model, it presents a lot of unique challenges, and I know a lot are grappling with that. Scaled Agile, as an organization behind the SAFE or Scaled Agile framework, they approach that with what's called lean portfolio management, but that's continuing to evolve. It was introduced about a year ago, and it's evolving rapidly as their clients learn, as they learn, and so forth. So I think we'll see that how to fund and how to evaluate the money spent against this will evolve. I know Apptio too is investing there with their Agile investment management product. So I think we'll see a lot of evolution in this space. But from what I see it is definitely the way companies are heading, especially in financial services. Most of the financial services firms we work with, Keith, they've been making this shift pretty aggressively. So I'm not surprised to see you all do it, and it's certainly not limited to financial services. I mean, we see it in the U.S. federal government, which you would think would be the antithesis of an agile model, in a world where money gets handed down from a political process and Congress, right? But they're doing it nonetheless. So it's pretty interesting to see. Thanks for going there. Jumping back to kind of let's jump into digital. And Annie, while we jump into this, why don't we open the digital poll of what's your company's appetite for investments in digital? And then Keith, if you don't mind, let's talk about, really what does that mean for Brinks? And, how is that, how are you sort of using that and creating transparency around digital, and what is it doing for your digital appetite, so to speak?
Sure. Well, again, being a very legacy company, we didn't have a whole lot around innovation from 160 years ago, with the exception of maybe the armored truck going, horse and buggy to an armored truck. So we knew that we had to inject more technology in our business to support it. And one of the problems that we're trying to solve with technology was trying to better understand the cash ecosystem around us, better sense that ecosystem. So we started to build a digital network from the edges, for us being our trucks and safes and branches and messengers, all the way back to our monitoring centers and processing centers, to really get a better understanding for us and our customers of what it would take to drive their business. So one of the investments that, I'll go back first to the strat plan that I came in with, a 30 basis point reduction. I'm proud to say that we overachieved that in the first couple of years, and we didn't have this digital strategy in place. It allowed us to realize that we could invest in this next strategy, this digital strategy, and we released to the street a strategy that we call 2.0. For us, it was creating a really simple one piece of that strategy is creating a very simple deposit box for our merchants. So any retailer that currently takes their cash at the end of the day, they bounce it out, they walk a check to the bank, they've got liability. They've got the cash that's sitting in their store at the time is at risk of theft, whether it be internal or external. And anytime they walk out the door and go to the bank, they've got risk of theft. They also have a period of time once they make that deposit for it to clear their account, so they don't have the working capital. And what we've introduced through technology, by being able to fund with some of those the extra funds that we freed up is a box that has RFID technology in it. It's got a scanner. We've created a mobile app for our customers to make deposits from those retail locations. So as they clear their cash registers, they make a deposit through this mobile app, reconcile it through a scan of the box that will open a software-defined lock that we have that will then open the deposit box. They drop it in. The bag that they're dropping in has an RFID tag that's reconciled within the box. So we now know there's contents for what the said to contain would be within that box. And then we provide provisional credit through a banking relationship that we have once it's deposited in that box. They have working capital essentially in 24 to 48 hours while it still resides in their location. It also allows us to have a less impactful touch for them. So previously we were doing, 5 days a week, up to 5 days a week, stops to pick up cash from these locations. Well, once it goes in that box, they no longer have any liability. It's all Brink's liability. So we can see when we need to be there to pick up that cash because we're providing that provisional credit on the front end. We don't need to do it daily. And it's enabling us to do 1 to 2 stops a week. So we have a lower touch, which, coincides right now with the pandemic. It's nice to be able to be less frequently in a location, but it also helps provide improved margins for us because I would say the cash in transit's not our high margin business. So if we can have less stops and be in front of the customer less often, it's a benefit to both parties. But it took the technology to bridge this. that's an example of one of our digital products that we've released as a result of the funding that we be able to free up, as well as our focus on this digital transformation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and TBM obviously helping you in terms of funding for that. Would you say, has TBM been affected by that sort of transformation, that going to digital? Have you had to look at things differently as a result?
We are. We're a little slow to get there, but we are actually just now socializing the definition of digital. And one of our, going back to benchmarks internally, we looked at our total cost of IT technology growth year over year growth versus our operating profit growth, and started through correlation and causation, saying, where did we have an impact with technology on that operating profit? So that's been a really good gauge for success over the last few years, to look at we actually are seeing our OP grow by about 5 times that of our IT spend as a percentage. And that's a nice metric to look at. But we are, beyond that, we're also defining digital, and we're going to start to track our digital investments versus our legacy investments differently than we have in the past as well. So that's socializing what digital means in a very legacy company is a bit of a challenge. And as we get full agreement and start to present this, then you'll build trust around the understanding of those definitions more so than we have today. But we're still early days of demonstrating what digital versus our legacy technology spend is.
Yeah, excellent. Hey, Greg is asking, has the increased transparency helped with IT planning and forecasting, which I think is so appropriate now, given how many are having to sort of replan on a rapid and sometimes more frequent sort of basis as things change with COVID. But has the transparency helped in that regard?
Tremendously. So I'm a zero-based budgeting guy. In an organization that's got a lot of fat, you've got to look at it in a zero-based fashion. So we do line item bottoms up, and we leverage Apptio's ITP module for that. It has been fantastic. So again, a global organization with disparate systems. We've got ERPs all over the globe. We have landed on a unified system that we've got largely leveraged in LATAM and in the US. And we're going to continue to try to scale that. But until then, the planning process was very, very, it was too generic. We didn't have the level of detail we had. So we do leverage ITP or IT planning within Apptio to get the details that we need, and it allows us to do scenario planning as well. So as I mentioned earlier, if we have a business case and we see that there's out year spend, we start to look at what is the impact over the course of the next 3 to 5 years of any spend that we bring in. It is heavily utilized, and without having a proper planning tool within IT, I don't think we could have made as much progress as we have, because it's you've got to take action once you have insights with the transparency. You have to take action, and that action comes by way of planning and forecasting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good kind of tie-in. Is it's one thing to see what you have to do. You have to plan, and you have to track against the plan. And it's not like either of those are easy on their own either. So, that's really good. Let me look. I've got a couple more in the Q&A, got some in the chat, and we've got about 10 minutes left. Let's at least take one of these. So Sean is asking a good question, and it kind of gets back to like how you have these conversations. And he's asking, when you transitioned the conversation from cost to alignment of apps and products and services, really getting to that business layer of the taxonomy, did you find that, one of those was easier to communicate conceptually, like apps or services? Like, how did it change that conversation?
Yeah, so I think in hindsight, you always learn what works and what doesn't. The easier conversations are typically around the shared service solutions, right? So HR systems, ERPs are typically easier discussions to have, because it's not going to impact the customer. whereas a solution or an application that's directly supporting a customer or anything that's generating revenue there's a lot more risk, and the tolerance for risk in the business that's struggling to build revenue or not necessarily struggling, but trying to continue to drive revenue doesn't necessarily want to align on something that could potentially put them at risk. So I would say, going in and rationalizing kind of the big shared systems would be the easier path. You build trust around that, and then you start to justify the rationalization around some of the other systems. We find that as we try to create a more standardized system, our business, again, in cash management or secure logistics, we have operating systems in every country that support those two lines of business. We should be standardized as much as we can across those, but every country or in some cases, customers have certain requirements, or we whether it's tied to compliance or something we contractually sign up to, they've got to have something that's less standardized. So when you go in and you start to say, we're going to provide you with a standard solution, there's a little bit of fear around losing the ability to deliver on something very specific in any one place. And we've learned from that. So we're now talking about creating a series of microservices that can bolt onto a more global standardized solution for countries as we start to rationalize those. But by having those conversations, we're learning about how to properly design for those scenarios, so that as we continue to socialize and try to gain alignment, we're really addressing the true needs of the business. We're also asking along the way that we consider our process for approving these exceptions, right? Because it doesn't always generate additional revenue or even necessarily mean that it's going to be the difference between retaining a customer or winning a customer. So there's a balance there that you have to work through, and it's these conversations that really drive it, because we've been living a world of habit for a long time, and if any one sales organization feels that they can support a customer, they're going to do it. So we've got to be able to justify why we should or shouldn't.
Yeah, that's terrific. Hey, one of the things I really want to ask, Keith, and we talked about this a bit, is just trust. We've talked a lot about the conversations that you're having. How has all this impacted or improved the trust that you and your organization has with the rest of your business?
Obviously trust is earned, and we've earned a great deal of trust over the last 3.5 years by way of what we've done, and sometimes that can come back and hurt as well. Some people don't want to have the transparency or understand, right? So while I don't know if there are some folks that would say they trust or don't trust, I think there's some avoidance that comes out of it too. So where we have trust, it's been material. It's really made a big difference. Our executive leadership team has complete trust in the IT and the product organization as we deliver. Anytime we take on a task or we deliver on new ways of being able to drive the business forward. I think as you get to a skip level or a couple of skip levels, that's where people feel at times you run up against people feeling threatened. So you've got to take them along for the journey and show them how they could also be heroes in this effort, because it really does turn the business around. And where you can get through to folks and partner with them and demonstrate that they themselves can lead this change, you start to earn their trust too. But it's having these fact-based discussions cause constructive conflict at times, and not everyone is welcoming conflict. A lot of people can be conflict adverse. So it's I think there's a bit of psychology that goes into this and earning trust as well, which is knowing how to speak to your audience. And one thing I've learned, and Todd, as you came out to do training, there was a gap that we had in the middle that we weren't addressing. So I would say trust, to really earn trust as early as possible, you want to speak to everyone in the audience, regardless of where they are in the organization. And I would say if there's a next time for me, I would start with that communication much more broadly across the organization, as opposed to the people that are directly touching the technology or the top business leaders. You want to hit everyone in the middle as well. Yeah,
that's fantastic. And I think that's very good advice, what you just gave there. it's one of those things where I think over communicating is probably the side you want to err on. There is a poll, Annie. We didn't apparently have the last poll, but Annie pulled up the very last one that we have. Love to hear from you all on this. Is just to what degree of trust do your business partners have in your IT or tech organization? And I promise this is anonymous, where we will only know the numbers in aggregate, so you can hopefully be very honest in your answer. But I'm very curious about this because this is a topic that comes up a lot with folks, and I would say almost that, one of the pains that we hear the most is this sort of visceral, qualitative sort of thing of trust rather than something that is more quantitative around, cost or something like that. So I'd love to see what your response is there. And Annie, when you think you're ready, go ahead and show the results.
I will. Todd, we also have the other one ready, I think. So bear with us so we can launch that one too.
Okay, go for it. And I see this one. So the good news is on this one is there's not mistrust, at least of the folks that responded to that. And so that's definitely a positive. Hopefully that reflects all the good work that our community has been doing in part with TBM. And while we're maybe the last few minutes, there's a couple of things I just wanted to ask really quick. Keith, one is, how would you characterize just TBM and what it's meant for you more personally, like how it's meant for your career path, things like that? If you don't mind sharing your thoughts there.
Thank you. So it's TBM for me is it's an extension of what I was doing and running a business previously. So I've been in the technology space now for just over a dozen years. And prior to that, I led operations, I led sales organizations, I did startups, some M&A, and the concept of TBM was one that I carried through. I've always been a P&L, as a P&L owner, I was always been laser focused on how do you improve top and bottom line. So it was a natural fit, and I immediately it resonated from the first day that I learned. I think initially, apologies to Apptio, I learned ITFM through Gartner first, and then met the folks at Apptio and learned a lot more about TBM. It's been huge for my career in technology. I'm not a technologist. I don't necessarily. I'll never claim to be a technology SME, but it's helped me to really focus on. And the timing of it around digital transformation and what companies need to do to rely on technology. It really helped me to better bridge the gaps between the business and technology. So transparency is paramount, I think, in any successful business. And where this was probably the biggest gap in any business that I've spoken to regarding where their largest costs and unknown costs would go, it was around technology. So it's personally, as well as the companies that I've been with, benefited us by having this kind of a framework, this kind of a forum, the TBM Council, and getting like-minded people trying to solve the same problems has really, really helped to drive success in both the companies I've been with as well as me personally.
Excellent. Keith, thank you for that. That was, I think, a great place to end. And I think you see from the last poll there, just the increased appetite for digital plays right into everything that we've talked about today. And frankly, I think it just highlights the need to manage tech, whether you call it IT, you call it tech, you call it digital, manage that purely in the context of your business is really crucial. I'm going to wrap up with just a few things. We're at the hour, but just 4 things I'll mention. One is all of you will receive an email from Apptio, obviously our founder and technical advisor, with what we call a wrap-up Wednesday demo. So this demo for tomorrow will be on benchmarking, which was obviously a topic of today. So if you are curious about how Apptio approaches that challenge, you'll see it in a very short 2 to 3 minute demo. Our next TBM Tuesday on August 11th will be with Amy Bialik, who I know is or was on the call today. She's a Fortune 50 TBM program leader, having spent time at both AmerisourceBergen and PepsiCo, and will share her experiences, which I'm really looking forward to. On August 13th, we'll have our next Standards Committee webinar. If you're interested in the standards that we do more of an educational webinar the first part of each month, first half of each month, and so we'll be doing that on the 13th. And then, of course, lastly is TBM Conference. If you're not registered for it, please do. This continues to evolve, obviously, in this new COVID world, and it's a virtual conference, but we're really looking forward to it. We're going to have a lot of great things starting in September, actually, with the CXO, Global CXO Forum, but then obviously going into November, which is when we usually have the TBM Conference. So it'll be a great time, and if you haven't registered, please do. With a virtual program, the cost of it has come way down, and of course, there's no travel. Lastly, Keith, I just want to thank you again. Thank you very much for being part of the community, an active part, having spoken at the conference, having engaged in a lot of ways, and being part of the Executive Advisory Board. And of course, thanks for your time and stories today. Annie and David, thank you for supporting today. It was great. And thank you all for attending. With that, we'll sign off, and we'll see you hopefully on August 11th.
Thank
Bye,
you,
everyone.
Bob. Thank you, Keith. Thanks, Todd. Bye, everyone.
Thank you all. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.